By the magic of a Methodist preacher, I'd been transformed into the state of husband. I looked the same on the outside, tall, skinny, unmuscled. But the magical word suddenly thrust me into the world of the married male, a condition for which I had no prior training. I wrote my parents, but not as often as they wished. At times in their letters, my parents cried out for news of their son. Their letters also included a monthly stipend of $50. It paid the rent. The day following our honeymoon, I placed a classified ad in the Laramie Boomerang, along with our new telephone number, offering my vaunted services to the world as the Penny Ante contractor. No job too big or too small. I bought a dilapidated 1932 Chevrolet Roadster, my first car, for $25. The top was gone, and two of the fenders as well. I built fences, sanded floors, stuccoed houses, repaired plumbing. But I was conditioned to hard work, and Anna wasn't afraid of it, and we didn't complain. To the contrary. I thought we were way out ahead of the pack. Anna took a job as a secretary at the university, and together we earned enough to feed ourselves, pay my tuition, and pay off my debt to the university for the student loans I'd incurred after I'd gone broke playing poker. For the first time in my life, I was devoted to my studies. My grades were excellent. During the school year, I labored weekends at the sponge iron plant where my father had worked before me. Dirty work. I came home at night to our small apartment exhausted, my body black with the iron dust, coughing, my lungs caked with the stuff. It didn't matter. I was going to be a lawyer, big-time lawyer. In spring of 1949, as we snuggled naked under the conjugal covers, Anna said, "I have good news." Then she threw her arms around me. "Jerry, you are about to become a father." I held on, stunned. "Aren't you happy?" she asked when she finally let me go. I was silent for a long time. At last I came out with the only words I could muster. "How can I be a father when I'm still only a child?" In August of 1949, my family returned from Bolivia. Having sold their home in Laramie before they left, my parents were now homeless, and my father was unemployed. They were living temporarily at Grandfather Spence's small plain farmhouse. My mother, I was later told, seemed to be marching on the edge of hysteria. Her bleak view of the family condition had them on the brink of disaster. 2 young children to raise, she and my father almost 50, no job, and no place to live. I hardly recognized my mother when the family came to Laramie on a Sunday afternoon for their first visit after their return. My mother hadn't changed much on the outside. Same out-of-style homemade dresses, same black shoes, but her hair had grayed at the temples and she looked thinner. Still, somehow, she was not my mother. When we hugged, she seemed stiff and distant. "This is Anna, your new daughter," I said. "I'm very glad to meet you," my mother replied politely. She held out her hand and gave Anna a small formal shake. Perhaps I thought she had always been stiff and distant. She had never been one to hold and to cuddle. She was compassionate. She listened and comforted. Sometimes she kissed me as mothers kissed little children. But I felt no internal passion ever escape from her. I held no memories of her crushing me close to her as I have crushed my own children close to me. I have no memory of her squeezing me so tightly I gasped for air, as I have squeezed my children. How vividly I see my mother standing in the kitchen, Anna standing next to her, her stomach already announcing the generation to come. I wanted excitement, I wanted unconfined exuberance, and I needed it to cover my own rising anxiety. My father held back, but he was smiling. My mother remained polite. At last she forced a small, quivery smile. I reached out for her hand. It was limp and unresponsive. She wasn't there. The eyes appeared blank. She spoke in a flat voice, no life in it. I led my parents into our tiny, dark green living room. My parents sat down on the couch, close together, not knowing quite how to settle in, so uneasy. My brother Tom, 8, and my sister Barbara, 10, huddled up close, staring at me with large blue children's eyes. I smiled back. I brought in kitchen chairs to sit on, Anna and me on this side of the room and them over there. You could feel the tension. We sat for a few minutes in near silence. Then my mother suddenly got up. "We have to go," she said abruptly. "Why?" I said. "You just got here. Can't you stay for supper?" "No, it's quite a drive back to Masonville, and the children are tired. Your father wants to go antelope hunting in the morning." Embarrassed, my father also got up. The children followed suit. "We'll see you soon," my father said quietly, and they walked out of the house like people headed for a graveside ceremony, heads bowed. Within the week, my father bought an old, run-down country store on the edge of Fort Collins in the poor part of town. A small living quarters had been built on the back of the store. The kids could go to school in Fort Collins. My mother could run the store, and he could get an outside job, and they could get their food wholesale. Now they had a plan. They would be moving from Grandpa Spence's place very soon, and then everything would be all right. The law school of the University of Wyoming in Laramie was perhaps the smallest, least prestigious of all university law schools in America. The floors were old, wooden, and creaky. No pictures hung on the wall. The rooms reflected neither care nor repair. It was a place utterly without vice, charm, or character. Its contents and surroundings accurately reflected the law. Nothing in these premises suggested that the law was either enlightening or interesting, alive or growing. I was to discover it was none of these. On the first day of law school in September of 1949, the dean spoke to the freshman class, a disparate bunch of 35 students. Most were intellectual, powerful, muscle-head, cigarette-smoking, thick glasses-wearing types. Most had never read a poem. Most had never sung a song, or cared to. In the next few minutes in his welcoming address, the dean informed us that half of us would be gone by the end of the first quarter, that law was a science as much as physics and chemistry, that the practice of law was a business, nothing more and nothing less, that lawyers are not knights riding around on white chargers seeking that holy grail called justice, that real lawyers develop sound billing skills, drive Buicks, and maintain the status quo, and that to be lawyers, we had to learn to think like lawyers. Think like lawyers. I wondered how a lawyer was supposed to think. Logically, without passion, I suppose. Drive out all feeling, for law was a science, and science was feelingless. In the years that followed, I was to learn that the professor's world was insular and arrogant. Justice to them was a sentimental idea that popped into the rhetoric of politicians and invaded stodgy old documents like the Constitution. Justice was just a phrase. Equal justice for all, carved over the doors of buildings like the United States Supreme Court. In the science of law, one could not abide such subjective concepts as justice, any more than one could talk about love as a component to a chemical formula. Law was law, and like science, law could not be understood by the unscientific mind. I therefore set out to think like a lawyer. However in hell one was supposed to achieve that skill. As my father was a hunter, so was I. In late September, in the elk season, I stole a weekend from my studies and went hunting into the Hoback Mountains with my closest friend, Jack Honholz. We headed for the high, rugged country and camped by a small stream. In the morning, we trudged up the mountain, far back into the timbered country, but we couldn't walk far enough up to where we knew the elk would be. That night, we rented 2 horses and rode them back to our camp. The next morning, we saddled up and rode higher than we'd gone the day before. About noon, we came onto a small herd of elk, and Jack and I both downed a bull. We dressed our animals and cut their carcasses in half. We lifted half an elk over each of our saddles, hitched our lariats to the other half, and led our horses back down to camp, each horse carrying half an elk and dragging the other half behind. At last, tired and content, we headed out, a winter's supply of meat secure in the trunk. We bumped slowly down over the same trail we'd come in on, until we rounded a curve and saw ahead of us, blocking the road, a forest green pickup truck, an orange dome light on top. Game warden. As we sat there, wondering what we'd done wrong, the warden got out of the truck and walked up to us. "Your name Jerry Spence?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I replied. As if we were relating the state of the weather, he said, "Your mother is dead. Better call this number." He handed me a slip of paper. What he handed me was more than a number. It was my ticket to hell. The paper bore Grandfather Spence's telephone number. Jack pulled the truck up to the first public phone we could find. My Uncle Hunter answered. "Better get up here, Jerry," he said. "Your mother's gone." "How?" I asked. "Well, Jerry, your mother took her own life." I drove all night. When I arrived, my father was with my brother and sister at Grandpa Spence's little wide-eyed kids, afraid, holding on to him. People weren't talking. My grandmother embraced me without saying anything. My father grabbed hold of me and wept. The sheriff had already been there and gone. The ambulance had taken her body away. Why, I asked. No note, no warning. Why? The damnable, unanswered question. Why? I asked Uncle Hunter. Don't know, he said. Barbara Jean was sleeping with your mother. Tommy was sleeping in the other bed. Barbara woke up in the middle of the night. Mother was gone. Her clothes were gone, too. The kids were talking, wondering where their mother was. That woke up the old folks. They went to the bedroom to find out what was going on. On Monday, your folks were going to start moving into that store your dad bought. Your dad was at the store that night doing inventory. He had to stay over because there was no one to watch the place. That's when she did it, while he was gone. Who found her? I asked. I did, Uncle Hunter said. She was in the ditch behind the house. She put your father's old 30-40 Craig in her mouth and pulled the trigger. Meat getting old gun. Heard my father call his rifle that 100 times. Uncle Hunter showed me the place, the ditch under a good apple tree, the same place where once as a child I had walked behind Grandpa Spence, his old mules pulling hard on the ditcher, clearing the ditch for water and for life. Many years later, I talked to my father about that day. 2 of his old friends had been called to help hunt for my mother. He met them after she'd been found, and he told me, I asked them 2 quick questions. Is she dead? Yes, they said. Did she suffer? No, they said. Then my father said, I fell to pieces. Oh, God, I thought, how can I tell Barbara and Tom? I finally got control of myself, and a little later I sat down with the kids in the front yard. I told them, Mother's gone. She won't be with us anymore. I let that soak in, and then I said, she's dead. We clung to each other. Then Tom burst out with it. Oh, Daddy, we're all alone. After Uncle Hunter showed me the place, I walked alone to the chokecherries below my grandfather's house. I sat down on the ground and laid my head between my knees, and I tried to weep. How could you do this, Mother? Your mother did not do this to you, I heard a voice say. It was you who did this to your mother. Then the voice began reading the charges. Was it not you who had abandoned her teaching, who turned your back on her church, who scorned her wishes? Was it not you who laid with the whores, who drank with the drunks, who smoked and desecrated your mother's life, and mocked her covenant with God? Was it not you who voided her promise to God, for you had rendered her helpless to fulfill her promise? Oh, God, forgive me, I cried. I did not know what else to say, but God didn't answer. All I heard was the singing of the blackbirds in the chokecherry trees. And my father, how could he forgive me? I had killed his love, his woman, his wife, the mother of his children. Had he not warned me? My sister, my little innocent brother, how could they forgive me? I had murdered their mother as well. At the mortuary, we said goodbye to her. The casket lay open. I stood at my father's left. Tom and Barbara hung on to him at his right. She lay as silent as any corpse. I wanted to speak to her. I wanted to run away, but I was a man and could not run. Then my father began to weep, and then he was kissing her face, her cheeks, her lips. The children stared at their father, at the living and the dead, their eyes like frightened rabbits. I could not touch the corpse. I was afraid to touch what surely I had wrought. I do not remember the service. I could not say who else was there. I cannot remember their taking the casket to the cemetery, or how they buried her next to little Peggy. I cannot remember the hole in the ground. I cannot recall their lowering the casket. I cannot remember leaving.